Arin Dlamini's violin fell abruptly silent when a scream pierced the air of the luxurious Ndlovu mansion. "Disgusting! Get out of here!" The crowd parted like the Red Sea, revealing Adan Ndlovu, the star of the evening, with tears streaming down her cheeks. Adan ran toward the garden, her blue silk dress billowing behind her like a flag of surrender. Arin, forgetting his role as a hired musician, followed her without hesitation. He found her huddled under a weeping willow, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The scent emanating from her was intense, a mix of musk and something indefinable that made Arin's nose wrinkle instinctively. But there was something more, an essence that went beyond the physical smell. "Are you okay?" he asked, approaching cautiously. Adan looked up, her large, wet eyes shining under the moonlight. "Why are you following me? Don't I disgust you like the others?" Arin sat beside her, deliberately ignoring the odor. "I've learned that true beauty transcends the senses." Meanwhile, inside the mansion, Thabo and Zola Ndlovu were struggling to control the chaos. "Please understand," Zola pleaded. "Adan has a medical condition. We've tried everything." "This is outrageous!" a bejeweled woman spat. "How dare you subject us to such—" Thabo interrupted, his voice tense with contained anger. "The party is over. I ask you all to leave." Suspense gripped the Ndlovu mansion. What fate awaits Adan? Don't miss a single moment of this captivating story. Subscribe now and witness this drama unfold. Among the dispersing crowd, a figure stood out. Kwame Maseko, a businessman known for his shrewdness, approached the Ndlovus. His smile didn't reach his calculating eyes. "Thabo, old friend," he said in a honeyed voice. "What an unfortunate situation. Perhaps I can help. I have contacts, specialists abroad who could treat Adan's condition." Zola looked at him, a spark of hope lighting up her exhausted face. "Could you really do that for us, Kwame?" "Of course," he replied, his voice smooth as velvet. "Though naturally I would expect a certain reciprocity in our future dealings." Before Thabo could respond, an unexpected sound filled the air. Music. Everyone turned toward the garden where Adan and Arin were returning together. Arin had retrieved his violin and was playing a soft, comforting melody. Adan walked beside him, her face serene despite the dried tears on her cheeks. "Mom, Dad," Adan said, her voice trembling but determined. "Arin. He didn't run away. He listened to me. He understood me." Kwame raised an eyebrow, his cold gaze evaluating the young violinist. "How touching," he murmured, a barely concealed tone of disdain in his voice. Arin met Kwame's gaze without flinching. "Mr. and Mrs. Ndlovu," he said firmly, "your daughter is extraordinary. I offer to give her violin lessons if she wishes. Music can be a powerful form of expression and healing." Thabo and Zola exchanged a look, a mix of surprise and caution in their eyes. Finally, Thabo nodded slowly. "Very well, young man, but you will be supervised at all times." "Thank you, Dad." Adan hugged her father, momentarily forgetting her condition. Kwame watched the scene, his smile freezing into a grimace. "Well, if you'll excuse me," he said, backing towards the exit. "We'll be in touch, Thabo. Don't forget my offer." As Kwame left, Arin gently took Adan's hand. "Ready for your first lesson?" Adan nodded, a spark of hope lighting her eyes for the first time in years. Together they headed towards the piano in the living room, leaving behind the chaos of the ruined party. Thabo and Zola watched them, their faces a mosaic of emotions. "Have we done the right thing?" Zola whispered. "I don't know," Thabo replied, his gaze fixed on the pair now sitting at the piano. "But our daughter is smiling. For now, that is enough." The first notes of the piano rose into the air, intertwining with the sound of the violin. For a moment, the scent that had always defined Adan seemed to disappear, replaced by the sweet promise of a new beginning. In the weeks that followed, Adan discovered a voice she never knew she had in the violin, a way to express all that words could not capture. Under Arin's patient tutelage, her fingers learned to dance on the strings, drawing melodies that seemed to defy her condition. However, the shadow of social rejection still loomed. Every time Adan ventured out of the mansion, the disgusted looks and poorly concealed whispers followed her like a toxic cloud. Despite her parents' efforts to maintain appearances, rumors about the smelly daughter of the Ndlovus spread like wildfire. One afternoon, while Adan practiced a particularly challenging piece, Zola entered the music room with a grim expression. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice tense, "Mr. Maseko is here. He wants to talk to us." Adan lowered her violin, a feeling of unease settling in her stomach. "Does it have to be now, Mom? Arin will be here soon for our lesson." Zola sighed, running a hand through her perfectly styled hair. "I'm afraid so, dear. Your father insists that you be present." Reluctantly, Adan followed her mother to Thabo's office. There, Kwame Maseko awaited them, his predatory smile contrasting with Thabo's tense expression. "Ah, the young violinist," Kwame greeted, his tone too sweet. "I hope I'm not interrupting your practice." Thabo cleared his throat. "Adan, Mr. Maseko has a proposal he wants to discuss with us." Kwame leaned forward, his eyes shining with an intensity that made Adan want to recoil. "I've been in contact with a specialist in Switzerland, a pioneer in treating unique conditions like yours, dear." "In Switzerland?" Adan's voice trembled slightly. "Exactly," Kwame continued. "Dr. Miller is willing to see you at his private clinic. The treatment could take months, perhaps a year, but he promises revolutionary results." Zola took her daughter's hand. "Think about it, sweetheart. You could have a normal life without stinking," Adan completed, her voice barely a whisper. Thabo stood up, his face a mask of determination. "This is a unique opportunity, Adan. Mr. Maseko has been very generous in facilitating this contact." Adan looked at her parents, then at Kwame, whose smile did nothing to hide the greed in his eyes. I need to think about it," she said finally. At that moment, a soft melody filtered in from the music room. Arin had arrived and begun to play, apparently unaware of the tension unfolding in the office. Kwame frowned. "You shouldn't postpone such an important decision for temporary distractions," he said, his disdain evident. Adan stood tall, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "Music is not a distraction, Mr. Maseko. It is part of who I am now." With that, she turned and left the office, leaving the adults in stunned silence. As she walked toward the music room, Arin's scent, a mix of violin resin and something indefinably comforting, enveloped her like a hug. "Is everything okay?" Arin asked, pausing his melody. Adan picked up her violin, a new determination shining in her eyes. "It will be," she replied. "Now, where did we leave off?" As the first chords of their duet filled the air, Adan realized she faced a choice that would define not just her future, but who she was at her deepest core. Music or normality, acceptance or a cure. And in her heart, she knew the decision would not be easy. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions for Adan. Kwame Maseko's proposal weighed on her like a dark cloud, overshadowing even the brightest moments of her music lessons with Arin. One afternoon, while they practiced a particularly complex duet, Arin noticed the distraction in Adan's eyes. "Your mind is elsewhere," he said gently, lowering his violin. "Do you want to talk about it?" Adan sighed, letting her own instrument rest on her lap. "It's complicated," she began, but soon the words flowed like an overflowing river. She told Arin about the clinic in Switzerland, the promise of a cure, the pressure from her parents, and Kwame's growing influence over family decisions. Arin listened in silence, his face a mask of concentration. When Adan finished, he remained quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Adan," he finally said, his voice laden with emotion, "I can't tell you what to do, but I can tell you this. In the short time I've known you, I've seen your strength, your kindness, and your talent. Your scent doesn't define who you are, but neither does the absence of it." Arin's words resonated with Adan, awakening feelings she had kept buried. Before she could respond, the music room door burst open. Kwame Maseko entered, followed closely by Thabo and Zola. I hope I'm not interrupting, Kwame said, his tone making it clear he didn't regret the intrusion. But we have urgent news. Thabo stepped forward, his face a mix of excitement and anxiety. Dr. Miller has advanced his schedule. He can see you next week, Adan. It's an opportunity we can't miss. Zola nodded fervently. Think about it, sweetheart. In a few months you could come home completely cured. No more looks, no more whispers, a normal life. Adan looked at her parents, then at Kwame, whose smile didn't hide the triumphant gleam in his eyes. Finally, she looked at Arin, who remained silent, his expression unreadable. Adan swallowed, her mind a whirlwind of doubts and emotions. I need time to think. Kwame frowned. Time is a luxury we don't have, dear. Dr. Miller has a waiting list of months. If we don't seize this opportunity now... I said I need time, Adan interrupted, her voice firmer than she felt. She stood up, holding her violin like a shield. Please respect that. With those words, she quickly left the room, leaving behind a tense silence. She ran to the garden, her refuge since that fateful night of the party. The scent of the flowers mingled with her own, creating a unique fragrance she no longer knew whether to hate or accept. Meanwhile, in the music room, the tension was palpable. Kwame looked at Arin with barely concealed hostility. I hope you're not filling Adan's head with impractical ideas, he said, his voice a low hiss. Arin stood tall, meeting Kwame's gaze without flinching. I only teach her music, Mr. Maseko, and to listen to her own heart. Thabo intervened before the situation escalated. I think we all need a moment to calm down. Arin, perhaps it's best if you leave for today. With a final glance toward the garden where Adan had disappeared, Arin nodded and left, leaving behind a silence heavy with unresolved tension. In the garden, Adan sat under the weeping willow, her mind a whirlwind of contradictory thoughts. On one hand, the promise of a normal life, free from the stigma that had plagued her since childhood. On the other, the music that had awakened a passion in her she never knew existed, and Arin, who saw her for who she truly was. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of red and gold, Adan closed her eyes and began to play. The notes flowed from her violin, a melody speaking of pain, hope, and the search for identity. And in that music, in that pure expression of her being, Adan began to glimpse the path she had to follow. The days slipped by like notes in a score, each one laden with growing tension. Adan found herself caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, her mind a battlefield between the desire for normality and her newfound passion for music. One morning, while the dew still sparkled on the garden grass, Adan slipped out of the mansion. With her violin firmly in hand, she headed to the nearby park where Arin often played for passers-by on weekends. She found him under an old oak, his bow dancing over the strings as a small crowd gathered around him. Adan stopped at a distance, watching as Arin's music touched the hearts of the spectators, their faces lighting up with each note. When the last melody faded into the air, Arin looked up and his eyes met Adan's. A warm smile lit his face as he made his way through the crowd to greet her. Adan, he said, his voice a mix of surprise and joy. I didn't expect to see you here. She returned his smile, though her eyes revealed her inner turmoil. I needed to see you, Arin. Away from the mansion, away from everything. Understanding the gravity of the moment, Arin nodded and led her to a nearby bench. They sat together, their violins resting on their laps like silent witnesses. I've been thinking a lot, Adan began, her voice barely a whisper. About Switzerland, the cure, my future, and about music. Arin remained silent, giving her space to express herself. My whole life, she continued, I've dreamed of being normal, of walking down the street without people moving away, without seeing the disgust in their eyes. And now, when that possibility is within my reach... Her voice broke, and Arin instinctively took her hand, ignoring the scent that surrounded them. But music, Arin, Adan pressed his hand. It has shown me a part of myself I didn't know existed, a beauty that goes beyond smell, beyond appearances. When I play, I am more myself than I have ever been. Arin nodded, his eyes shining with emotion. "Music has that power," he said softly. "It reveals who we truly are." "But my parents," Adan sighed, the weight of family expectations visible on her slumped shoulders. "They have sacrificed so much for me. How can I disappoint them?" Before Arin could respond, a familiar voice cut through the air like a knife. "Adan!" They both turned to see Kwame Maseko approaching rapidly, followed closely by Thabo and Zola. Kwame's expression was a mix of triumph and disdain. "So here you are," he said, his voice dripping with disapproval. "Sneaking off to meet him." Thabo stepped forward, his face a mask of concern. "Adan, dear, you had us worried. Why didn't you tell us you were going out?" Zola, noticing the curious glances from passers-by, tried to smile. "Come on, dear. This is not the place for a family conversation." Adan stood up, a new determination shining in her eyes. "No, Mom, this is the perfect place. Here, surrounded by music and real people, not walls and prejudices." Kwame frowned, his false concern crumbling. "Foolish girl," he hissed. "Don't you see you're throwing your future away? For what? A street violinist and the illusion of being a musician?" Arin stood, protectively placing himself beside Adan. "Mr. Maseko, I suggest you watch your words." The tension in the air was palpable. Passers-by began to stop, drawn by the unfolding drama. Adan looked around, seeing the curiosity and, in some cases, disgust in the eyes of strangers. For a moment, she felt the old fear creeping in. But then, in an act of pure instinct, she lifted her violin and began to play. The first notes were shaky, but soon they grew firm and clear. The melody that flowed from her fingers was a pure expression of her soul, of her struggle, of her desire to be accepted as she was. Arin, understanding what was at stake, joined her. Their violins intertwined in a dance of sounds, creating a symphony that spoke of pain, hope, and above all, self-acceptance. The crowd, initially surprised, soon found themselves captivated. One by one, the faces of disgust transformed into expressions of awe and emotion. Adan's scent, though still present, seemed to dissolve in the beauty of the music. Thabo and Zola watched in amazement, seeing their daughter in a new light. Kwame, on the other hand, stepped back, his influence fading with each note. When the last note faded into the air, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then, like a wave, the applause erupted. Tears rolled down the cheeks of some spectators, moved by the performance. Adanne lowered her violin, her face radiant despite the tears that glistened in her eyes. She turned to her parents, her voice firm but filled with emotion. "Mom, Dad, this is who I am. My scent is part of me, but it doesn't define me. Music has shown me that I can touch people's hearts, that I can be accepted and admired for what I can create, not judged for how I smell." Thabo stepped forward, his eyes shining with emotion. "Adan, But before he could continue, Kwame intervened, his voice dripping with venom. "This is ridiculous. Are you going to throw away years of planning for a moment of applause? What will happen when the novelty wears off?" The silence that followed Kwame's words was deafening. The crowd, still moved by Adan and Arin's performance, watched expectantly, as if witnessing the final act of a dramatic opera. Adan Ndlovu, who had remained silent, stepped forward. His face, usually a mask of businesslike control, now showed a mix of emotions: pride, confusion, and above all, a deep realization. "Kwame," he said, his voice firm but filled with emotion, "for years I have trusted your judgment in business, but this goes beyond business. This is about my daughter, her happiness, her identity." He turned to Adan, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "My dear daughter, I have failed you. In my quest to cure you, I didn't realize I was trying to change the very essence of who you are." Zola stepped forward, taking her husband's hand. "Adan, darling, your music. I've never seen you so alive, so yourself. How could we have been so blind?" Kwame, seeing his influence slipping away, tried one last argument. "You are being irrational. What about the investment in the clinic, the contracts we signed? Thabo straightened up, his posture regaining the firmness of the successful businessman he was. Contracts can be renegotiated, Kwame, but the trust and love of my family are priceless. Our collaboration ends here. Kwame, furious, looked around for support but found only disapproving faces. With a final growl of frustration, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Adan, overwhelmed with emotion, hugged her parents. The scent emanating from her, once a source of shame, now seemed to blend with the park's air, becoming just another part of the moment. Arin approached, a warm smile on his face. Adan, that was incredible. Your music, your bravery. She turned to him, her eyes shining. I couldn't have done it without you, Arin. You showed me that true acceptance begins with oneself. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. An older woman stepped forward, tears in her eyes. Young lady, your music has touched my soul. When will you give your next concert? Adanne blinked in surprise, looking to her parents for guidance. Thabo smiled, nodding in approval. I think it's time the world knew the true talent of my daughter. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Adanne's story, the young woman with a unique scent and extraordinary talent for the violin, spread like wildfire. The local media dubbed her the aromatic violinist, a title Adan accepted with a mix of amusement and pride. Adan's first official concert was organized at the city auditorium. On the night of the event, the venue was packed to the brim. Backstage, Adan's heart beat to the rhythm of a fast-paced symphony. Nervous? Arin asked, adjusting his own violin. Adan took a deep breath, her scent mingling with the polished wood smell of the instruments. A little, but for the first time in my life, I feel whole. Thabo and Zola approached for a final hug before Adan took the stage. We are proud of you, darling, Zola whispered. Go and show them who you really are. When Adan stepped onto the stage, there was a moment of expectant silence. She could feel everyone's eyes on her, could imagine their thoughts as they perceived her characteristic scent. But this time, instead of shrinking back, she stood tall with confidence. She lifted her violin, placed it under her chin, and began to play. The first notes floated into the air, soft and tentative, but soon the music grew in intensity and passion. It was a melody that spoke of struggle, of acceptance, of the beauty found in difference. As she played, Adan felt that each note was a part of her story. The violin sang her past pain, her newfound joy, her hopes for the future. And the audience felt it. Faces that initially showed curiosity or even apprehension transformed, lighting up with emotion and wonder. At a culminating moment of the piece, Arin joined her on stage. Their violins intertwined in a duet that spoke of understanding, of love, of the harmony that can arise when we accept and celebrate our differences. When the last note faded, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then, like a wave, the applause erupted. The audience stood, giving a standing ovation, tears in their eyes. Bouquets of flowers rained onto the stage, their fragrance mixing with Adan's scent in a unique olfactory symphony. Adanne looked at the audience, at her parents clapping with pride from the front row, at Arin smiling beside her. In that moment, she knew she had found her place in the world. Her scent, once her greatest shame, was now part of her artistic signature, as unique and special as her music. As she bowed to the audience, a journalist approached the stage. Adan, she called over the applause, you've captured the audience. What's next for you? Adan smiled, her face radiant with happiness and confidence. This is just the beginning, she replied. There's a whole symphony ahead, and I'm ready to play every note. The ovation continued, the sound of applause mingling with Adan's unique scent, creating a sensory experience none of the attendees would ever forget. In that moment, Adan realized her journey had not only changed her life, but had the power to change others' lives too. Her story was a testament that our differences, what makes us unique, can be our greatest strength if we have the courage to embrace them and the creativity to express them. Adanne's story teaches us that true beauty and talent transcend physical barriers and social prejudices. It reminds us that each of us has a unique melody to share with the world if we dare to play it. What do you think the future holds for Adanne? How do you think her music and bravery will inspire others? Share your thoughts in the comments and be part of this conversation about acceptance, courage, and the transformative power of art.